It's great to be here and very greatly appreciate the putting together of this conference and especially the topics because Dvaita, Vishishta Dvaita, Advaita, it's good to think about it in an organized way so that it will clarify some of the ideas we might have in our own minds. Dvaita before Chaitanya was in the 15th century. And how do we go about studying Dvaita before that period? And oftentimes there are two ways of studying any subject. One is, of course, to kind of go and take a look at specific teachers or traditions before Chaitanya to see how those Dvaita traditions developed and were propagated. And that kind of an analysis is important, it's very helpful. But there is also another kind of study, and that is, how was Dvaita before 15th century in relation to other schools of thought? And that's another branch of study called relational studies. It's a little bit like when we go to buy a house. Of course, when we want to buy a house, we go inside the house and see whether there is everything in it that to our satisfaction. But we don't simply look inside the house. We also come out and see what's the neighborhood like? How far is my backyard? How is the school district? So even to make a decision about buying a house, we see where that house stands in relation to other houses in that area. And so this relational study is as important as analytical study. And so I had this thought in my mind that the kind of conference we are having here, what if a similar conference was held in the 12th or 13th or 14th centuries? What would the Dvaitins, the dualists of that period, be thinking in relation to the other schools of thought? Because all these three schools of thought have been around for a long time. And so it is this relational aspect that I would like to focus on in the next few minutes. Although there are these three different schools of thought, it's not as if they differ with each other in every respect. In fact, they share a lot in common. Among the things in common that they share is the idea of the self, the Atman. That normally when you and I speak about the self, which is like I'm pointing this, but this is really pointing at the body. All these three schools of thought, they agree that the body and mind are not the Atman. There's complete agreement. Where they differ is how this self, this reality within me, how is this related to the reality behind this entire universe? How are they two related? Now, generally, this is how these things get described. Those who believe that these two entities, the reality here and the reality behind the world, are separate, related, but separate. For instance, like a parent and a child. They're related, but a parent and child are two different personalities. The other way to relate them is, as Swami Tyaganandaji and others before have pointed out, looking upon the reality here as a part of that larger reality. And the example is, of course, between, if you think about the flowers, the leaves, the branches of a tree, they are a part of a tree, but they are different from a tree, and yet they belong to a tree. And a third way of relating is that even though the reality here and the reality beyond may look different, that difference is only in appearance, not in really. Really they are one. And that would be the Advaita school of thought. So that's where the difference is. So whenever we see these different ways of thinking, one question, of course, that comes to mind, well, who's right? If we're just talking about one truth, and if these three people are speaking about it in three different ways, who is right? And so, throughout centuries, the people belonging to these different schools of thought have argued a lot. And as people generally do, many of them have tried to show we are right. And they have tried to point out mistakes or weaknesses in other ways of thinking. And of course, when someone points out a weakness, then these other schools of thought, they responded by plugging the loopholes in what seemed like loopholes and saying, no, this is not really a mistake. This is what is meant. No philosophy is perfect. And so if you are looking for errors or weaknesses, it's easy to do so. But there are also ways of responding to it. So paradoxically, when each of these three groups were trying to prove others were wrong, they were also making them strong. Because there's so much of Vedanta literature over the centuries, it's been about one group debating the weaknesses of the others, the other group responding by showing, no, these are not our weaknesses, in fact, you are weak. The end result was they ended up, one of these three philosophies became truly strong and truly robust. That is why even today, in spite of all these arguments back and forth, all of these three schools of thought still exist and are still going strong. So this first way of trying to show that one of them is right, the others are not right, this kind of an exclusivistic model did not really work. Then there was a few others among them who said, no, it's not really too politically correct also to say the others are completely wrong. One way would be to say, no, they're all right. All of them are right. And one way is called the inclusivistic model. And the approach is called the teleological approach, in which case you say, why not think about it as a staircase, as a ladder, that one leads to the other. And so we accept all, looking at them in an evolutionary manner. And that is one way of looking at it. And the most popular, the evolutionary model, clearly is of course Dvaita, then Vishishta-Dvaita, and Advaita. More or less like the way the sessions in this conference have been arranged. I don't know whether that was the idea behind it. But that's one way. And it might seem as if this inclusivistic model brings about a harmony because we are not rejecting everyone, all are being accepted. I'm not very sure whether this is a very harmonious model. Because, for instance, if you think about Dvaita as the first stage, Vishishta-Dvaita as the next step, Advaita, I think Advaitins probably will not have any problem with this, but they are very problems. But the Dvaitins are not going to be happy, nothing much harmonious there for them. And so this inclusivistic model has that problem as well. And so we need to look at this problem over these three different viewpoints and say, is there another way to try to discover harmony among them? And the good starting point for that is to see that these three big names associated with these three schools of thought, Madhvacharya, Ramanujacharya, and Shankaracharya, there is this title, Acharya, appended to their name. We need to take that word Acharya very seriously. Centuries ago, this was not a word that was easily applied to anyone and everyone. Acharya is something to be taken very seriously. So who is an Acharya? Not simply someone who has read the scriptures, but has understood the essence of the scriptures, and even more importantly, has experienced the truth of that text in their own lives. So all of these acharyas were enlightened beings. And if they were enlightened beings, one might say, if they all experienced the same truth, how come then, when they started describing it in so many different ways, even apparently mutually contradictory ways, how could there be so much difference in their expression if what that they experienced was the one and the same thing? And a simple, rather trite example to this would be, if we say 10 people walk up to go to a Starbucks, there are 3 or 4 in this area, I just checked yesterday, and then all of them say, order a latte, and then they all have latte, brewed at the same time from the same thing. And then they are asked, write an essay on your experience. And if they come from different language groups with different cultural backgrounds and so on, then their essay is going to look very different. The essay will be in a different language, the symbols, the analogy, the approach would be very different, yet all of them come from the same market. And their expression is very different. And this is true with such an ordinary thing as just simply drinking coffee or latte. Think about this profound, transcendent experience that someone has, and then they are asked to describe about it. Sri Ramakrishna says, we know from reading his life and his conversations how often he went into samadhi, that deep absorption when he was not even aware of anything around himself. And then after a while, when, as we normally say, when his mind came down to this plane of consciousness, then sometimes he would describe what he saw or what he meant. Some of these profound observations came after that state. Sri Ramakrishna said, when I begin to speak after that state of samadhi, I've already come down 100 feet from that height. Because at that, when he is in that state, there are no words. There's nothing to say. In fact, he couldn't even stand straight, somebody to hold him. So when these teachers begin to express themselves, they have already come down a lot. And when they come down at this level, to express ourselves, we need language. Now, language is great. We can convey and exchange our thoughts and ideas in a language, but it's still a very limited tool. Not everything can be expressed in language. But take a simple question of coffee. If someone drinks the coffee and says, how was the coffee? Say, awesome, it's tasty. That doesn't convey anything except that you liked it. But you have no idea what that taste was. So words are very limited. But that's all that we have right now. So that's the first thing to keep in mind, the difference between experience and expression. Sri Ramakrishna's teaching in Bengali is called Chotomat Totopat, and sometimes gets translated as there are as many paths as there are religious faiths. And that's a fairly good way of translating that teaching of Ramakrishna. But the word there is simply mat. It's not specific about religion. It's about a way of thinking. That if there is a way of thinking, based on a text, based on a scripture, coming from a trusted, enlightened source, then each of that is a way that can take us to that truth. So rather than thinking about Dvaita, Vishishtadvaita and Advaita as steps on a ladder, as something that somehow, something sacrosanct about oneness that they are leading to, it's good to see that they are different. They are different. But just because they are different, the starting point may seem different, but they ultimately will take us to that same enlightenment. So what we want is not so much a labeling of this or that, but whether each of these 3 schools of thought have the ability to give me that highest experience, that highest truth. So, and that is why Swami Tyagananda, Sri Ramakrishna, and everyone in the tradition have emphasized again and again that religion is realization, religion is experience. It's not about attending lectures or conferences. It's not about reading books. It's not about going to retreats. All of these things are helpful. But ultimately, true religion is about what we experience. And so finally, if we want to think in terms of the statements, I mean, for instance, people say, I'm a dualist or I'm a non-dualist. And we can say, what does it even mean? When someone says, I'm a non-dualist, does it mean that you intellectually appreciate the idea? Or you emotionally, it resonates with you? Have you actually experienced it? Human beings are very complex creatures. It's just not possible to pigeonhole ourselves into one of these three schools of thinking. It's possible in the same person, someone who intellectually greatly appreciates the idea of non-duality, emotionally still feels that connection. I have seen many among the Ramakrishna devotees who study Mandukya speak about non-duality, says that's the truth. And then, I'm a child of mother. There's nothing wrong with it. But that's what I mean by the complexity of it. Intellectually, I might appreciate something. Emotionally, something else is happening. And possibly, as far as the experience is concerned, probably we have not had any. And so, while in intellectual terms, so to get some amount of clarity, it's good to study all these different schools of thought and listen to these ideas. But as far as our own personal spiritual life is concerned, I feel it's not necessarily very helpful to start with labeling ourselves and saying, I'm a dualist or I'm a non-dualist. What is more important is to ask ourselves, am I earnest? Am I sincere to the backbone? Am I seeking the truth? Am I willing to go where the truth will lead me? Whether the truth is dualistic or not, God will tell me what it is, but I'm going to follow the truth. So if I'm earnest, if I'm sincere, if I'm determined, I should start walking. Sri Ramakrishna says, even by chance, if I take a detour or probably on some wrong track, but if I'm earnest, if I'm sincere, God's grace will put me on the right track. And so that I feel is very helpful when we think in terms of these three schools of thought. That it's Madhva, Ramanuja, Shankara. They were not some academic hacks somehow trying to prove their thesis. They were expressing what they had experienced. We must respect that, we must honor that, and recognize that every person, if they are sincere, earnest, truthful, they will ultimately reach the goal. Even when what they start with could seem as a very dualistic path. Because sometimes not, in fact many times, people think that in order to be a non-dualist, I need to study something, I need to do meditation, I need to do this. But dualist, by default, everyone is a dualist. Wrong. By default, everyone is a materialist. We are not even dualists. Because what does the dualist say? A dualist says, yes, I and God are different, but I am. God is. How often in a 24-hour cycle do I remember that God exists? Maybe a little bit for a few moments when I pray or meditate. Rest of the time when we are busy doing things, are we even aware that God exists? So we are not even dualists, really. So it's wrong to think that by default everyone is a dualist. That's not true. Secondly, it's helpful to remember the primacy of experience in our lives. That we may talk, but if you have not experienced anything, all that talk amounts to nothing. That's why a dualist with a spiritual experience is better than a non-dualist with no experience. So some of this idea that one is higher than the other, or somehow one is an evolution of the other, is not very helpful. And so these are some of the thoughts that came to my mind today when I was thinking about Dvaita before Chaitanya in terms of in a relational way of how Dvaitans, not just before 15th century really, I would imagine a lot of what I said may be acceptable to Dvaitins even after 15th century. But I think along with this kind of a study of these different schools of thought in an analytical way, it might be helpful. And I'm sure this is the kind of relational study will be touched upon by other speakers today and tomorrow as well. So there is a lot to think about, and a big feast is on a way with so many enlightened teachers amongst our midst. So let us try to make the best of what we learn in this weekend. Namaskar.